There is no political freedom without economic freedom. The word freedom means different things to different people. Yet, at its foundation is a simple idea that we must have the freedom to live the lives we choose as long as it doesn't harm others. Economic freedom sits at the heart of this claim. We believe it is the essential freedom that enables all other freedom and indeed prosperity. With this firm belief, a group of academics and professionals formed Advocata Institute as an independent policy think tank in 2016. Our objective was to advocate sound policy reforms to put Sri Lanka towards a path that is freer and more prosperous. We believe the main driver of economic growth is only achievable by having simplified taxes, secure property rights, free flow of ideas and people, sound monetary policy with a limited yet capable slate that promotes free trade, competition and entrepreneurship that empowers creative destruction and also safeguards the most vulnerable citizens through social safety nets. In this space of 6 years, the Advocata Institute has progressed to become a key influencer in media and with policymakers. In this short period, the Advocata Institute has also been recognized as a force in the global think tank rankings for its work on policy advocacy. As Sri Lanka reels through our worst economic crisis since our independence, the country is in need of a fundamental reset, a rethink of policies and practices that brought us here. Sri Lankans on the streets want a system change. Advocata is dedicated to scale up our programs to discuss, debate, and advocate for a set of new policies which can make that change happen, so that together we can build a new aspirant society that values human dignity, choice, and brings about prosperity for all.
Advocata Institute came about due to the efforts of a few concerned citizens who were concerned about the actions of people who were espousing a closed economy, derages, autarky, big government, and homegrown solution. Our journey basically thus far has been challenging, and what we have been able to achieve is to get our core mission, which is about libertarian values across to our core market. We target young people between the ages of 16 and 35. Primarily through our social media channels, Advocata for English, Advocata Plus for Sinhala, and Advocata Kural in Tamil. We also have presence in mainstream media. We have a serious threat of a hollowed society where the young and the brightest leave us. This conference is about keeping hope alive. It is a discussion of ideas that work. The need of the hour is pragmatism, not dogmatism.
Let's reset Sri Lanka. Welcome to Reform Now Conference.
I would now like to introduce the speakers for the first fireside chat for today, which is on learnings from Thailand's reform experience after the Asian financial crisis in 1997. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Veerathai Santiprabhob, former Governor of the Bank of Thailand, macroeconomist and financial professional. Joining him is Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee, CEO of JB Securities and Chairperson of Advocata Institute. Over to you, Mr. Murtaza and Dr. Veerathai.
Thank you, everyone. This session will continue for about an hour, and it has been termed a fireside chat. So we are just going to speak about Thailand's experience after the 1997 financial crisis. I believe that if you want to get across any questions towards the end of our chat, there's a Slido platform and you can type in your questions, and I have access to your questions. So first of all, Dr. Veerathai, thank you very much for coming to Sri Lanka. we had to change the dates a few times because of all the difficulties. It doesn't look like this is a country under crisis, right?
Thank you very much, Murtaza. A very good morning, Mr. President, and to the audience. Very delightful to be here. No, I agree with you. My first impressions when I arrived yesterday, the experience that I had yesterday was not like a country is in the crisis as it has been portrayed in the international media.
Okay. So when your name was nominated, I looked you up on Wikipedia. And it says that you graduated from Harvard at age 22. Is that correct?
No, that's 24.
Right, but still very young. So were you a child prodigy?
I don't think so. A lot of good opportunities presented to me throughout high school and university. That's how I managed to get through college education faster than standard.
Okay. During a brief conversation last night, you also told me that you ordained as a monk for a short period of time, and you also practice Vipassana meditation. Could you share for the audience how meditation has helped you in your career and as the governor?
Very much so. I think Vipassana meditation is could be helpful for anyone, because the truth of life is the interactions between body and mind, and we all tend to focus on taking care of our own body without properly taking care of our own mind. So being able to cultivate mindfulness is very important, particularly in the current world when we have to deal with complex issues. And when I had to serve as the governor, I must say that I wouldn't be able to perform my duty as well as I did if I didn't practice or if I had not practiced Vipassana meditation. But personally, I think Vipassana meditation has helped generate calmness in the way I interact with people and in the way that I interact with or deal with complicated issues. The other thing that is very important for a central bankers are always standing in conflicts of interest. When interest rates goes up, depositors enjoy it, but borrowers would complain about it. When the exchange rate devalues, exporters are happy about it, but importers do not like depreciation. But those who enjoy it always keep silent. But those who don't enjoy it, those who will not benefit from it, always criticize you. And central bankers need to be sure that we have neutral state of mind with unbiased view to be able to carry out our function. So when I was the governor, I also tried to introduce meditation, mindfulness practice into the bank, particularly for the young central bankers. I think it's very important for us to be able to carry out our central banking duty, to have mindfulness and also to have mental immunity.
Thank you for sharing the personal side of your life. If we can move on to the discussion today, can you, for the benefit of the audience, set the context of how the Thai financial crisis in 1997 came about?
Thank you. The Thai financial crisis of 1997 could be categorized as a combination of a currency crisis and a banking crisis. A currency crisis because we had a very large short-term debt. In 1996, preceding to the 1997 crisis, our short-term debt that were coming to due within a year exceeded the amount of international reserves that we had. So meaning that all the foreign debts could be called. If they were not renewed, we would not have sufficient international reserves to pay back the debt. Also, if you may recall, China entered WTO in early 1990s. So Thailand used to have large current account surpluses all along. But then there was a drop we had good export growth all along. But then early 1990s, our export growth started to come down. We had large current account surplus, a large current account deficit. And our current account deficit stayed in the range of about 7% of GDP for 4 or 5 years, leading to the crisis. Current account deficits also reflected the fact that we had overinvested in a number of sectors, particularly sectors that were not generating foreign exchange. But we used a lot of foreign borrowing, particularly the private sector, had borrowed substantially to invest in real estate, in golf courses, in condominiums, property complex, and those were not generating foreign exchange. And on top of that, we also had fixed exchange rate regime. That was a big policy mistake. And the Bank of Thailand at that time was trying to defend the fixed exchange rate, basically using up all the international reserves. So we had international reserves at about 30 billion US dollars at the end of 1996, when we had to float the exchange rate in July of 1997. We had zero international reserves. It's a combination of capital outflows, foreign creditors calling back loans, and using out of international reserve to defend the exchange rate. So that's on the currency crisis front. The other part of the crisis was a banking crisis. We had a number of small finance companies. These were not banks, but they're operating as if they were banks. We had about 91 of them, if I recall correctly, in 1996. And they had very poor risk management framework. And with the fixed exchange rate regime and the policies of the Bank of Thailand that was trying to control overheating economy. So there was a huge interest rate spread between domestic interest rate and international interest rate. And on top of that, the government would like to promote Thailand as an international financial center. So the government and the bank and the central bank were trying to encourage local banks to do international banking facility, mainly trying to allow them, taking out all the regulations for what we call the out-in transactions, borrowing abroad for domestic investment. And so there was a big mismatch of currencies that I mentioned, borrowing in US dollars for domestic use, generating baht revenue, and also a big mismatch of maturity, borrowing short terms for long-term investment. So the balance sheet of the banks were very, very weak. And we also had asset price bubbles when there was huge inflows coming in. And if you may recall, early 1990s, Thailand was considered as a fifth tiger of Asia. Everyone had very high hope for the future of Thailand. And with lax regulatory framework, when the whole environment changed, that led to a banking crisis. So, to recap, we had combinations of currency crisis and banking crisis. And this currency crisis and banking crisis were originated by firstly, policy mismanagement from the central bank part. We had what we call the impossible trinity. And as anyone who studies macroeconomics would fully aware that we can't have a regime with free capital mobility and independent monetary policies and fixed exchange rate. Those are the impossible trinity. But we had that system before the 1997 crisis. The Ministry of Finance also didn't want to support the change of the exchange rate regimes. No politicians would like to have devaluation during that term. I think that's a fact of life, and it was not clear whether which organization had full authority over the exchange rate regime. At that time, it was a joint responsibility between the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. The government also didn't want to slow down the overheating economy, and they all thought that having higher investment is always good. We didn't pay sufficient attention as to the types of investments and the quality of investment. Investment in assets in speculative to support speculation in asset prices, that should not be considered as healthy investment, unlike foreign direct investment that we used to get towards the end of 1980s. We also had what I would say a weak political system. We had coalition governments, and the coalition governments consisted of support from small parties. And when you have coalition government with many small parties, it was always difficult to make big decisions, particularly reform decision. And the other major factor that I should highlight is the lack of good governance in the private sector. Large corporations and the banks, there were a lot of connected transactions between the mother company and subsidiaries, not transparent disclosures of their financial positions. The stock exchange was also a problem at that time. A lot of stock prices manipulation and not up to standard as one would expect for publicly listed companies. So that created a lot of distorted incentives leading to combinations of banking crisis and currency crisis.
I think one area you missed is about the fiscal situation. What was the fiscal situation leading up to the crisis?
Our fiscal situation was very strong. Thailand had very high growth towards the end of 1980s and early 1990s. The fiscal deficit before the 1997 crisis was in the range of 1 to 2% of GDP. And our public debt to GDP was also quite low, a single digit, I think below 10%.
Must have been running a primary balance surplus, right?
Yes, for some years before the crisis.
Okay. So if we can move on, what was the steps that you all took initially to stabilize the economy? Maybe you can let us know when the crisis broke, what happened to Thailand?
Yeah, the magnitude of, maybe I touch on the magnitude of the crisis so that you have a good overview of the problems that we had to deal with. The Thai baht was floated in July of 1997. Before it was floated, the exchange rate was 25 baht per $1. And then the value of the currency is dropped to, at its lowest, about 57 baht per US dollar, from 25 to 57 in January of 1998, so within the period of 6 months. And obviously that led to massive bankruptcy because large corporations or even medium-sized firms, they had external loans through the Bangkok International Banking Facility lendings. And as I mentioned earlier, the banks, the finance companies were competing in getting cheap funding from abroad in US dollar and lending to...
You had an open capital account?
On inflows.
Not on outflows? Not on
outflow. The outflows, capital account, there were some restrictions. But because of the overly externally leverage of the banks and the corporations, when the exchange rate devalued from 25 baht to 56 baht, 57 baht, it led to massive bankruptcy for firms, a large proportions of firms that depended on external financing. The GDP contracted by about 1.5% in 1997, and further by an additional about 10 or 11% in 1998. So in total, 2 years after the crisis, real GDP contracted by close to 12%. And it took us about 5 years before real GDP went back to the pre-crisis level. The amount of distressed assets that we had to deal with during the Asian financial crisis was substantial. Non-performing loans in the banking system shot up to about 47% of balance sheets of the bank. Imagine, half of assets in the banking system were NPLs. And these were the banks that survived the crisis. We also had to close a number of finance companies. We had 91 finance companies before the crisis. A few years afterwards, we had 19. So we closed down a large amount of finance company. And if you add up the number of NPLs on balance sheet of banks and the amount of distressed assets that we had to deal with, it amounted to close to about 70% of our GDP. So that's the magnitude of distressed asset that we had to deal with. But if we didn't do it, we would not be able to return this distressed asset to productive use and can't promote restructuring. The massive bankruptcy also led to massive laying off of people. There were large amount of employees that were let go by bankrupt corporations. Before the 1997 crisis, we had one-way migration of young people from the rural area to Bangkok, to big cities, to industrial estates. After the 1997 crisis, there's a reverse migration. Large amount of people had to go back to their rural villages. And indeed, the rural economy, the rural villages that were not affected badly by the crisis serve as a social safety net for large amount of people that went home. Public debt to GDP shot up afterwards, as I mentioned before the crisis, is a single digit. The cost of financial sector restructuring was estimated in the range of 30 to 40% of GDP at that time. And the amount of public debt subsequently increased along the way as the government had to fiscalize the cost of financial sector restructuring. So public debt to GDP from single digit went up to 40%, 35, 40%. After we managed to deal with the distressed assets and the banks that the government had to intervene and take control. And the livelihood of people was badly affected along the way. But as the president mentioned in his speech, the engines that could support the quick recovery of the Thai economy was exports. We had diversified economy. We had good manufacturing base. We were part of the regional supply chain. So when the exchange rate devalued from 25 to 56 and then stabilized at about 40, 45, the exporting sectors benefited substantially. Tourism sector also benefited substantially. And the agricultural sector, the people who went back to the rural areas, they could produce agricultural products and generated good income because the agricultural prices went up when the currency devalued. So because of the exports and tourism, that led to relatively quick turnaround of some segments of the economy.
If I can now turn to exploration, what happened to the political environment when the crisis broke, and how did that solve itself?
Yeah, the political environment was quite fragile. We had the floating of the exchange rate in July. That's when people say that's the origin of the Asian financial crisis. The Minister of Finance resigned before the floating of the exchange rate. I think that was also part of the problem leading to the lack of confidence. Everyone was wondering, the Minister of Finance should know something that people might not know. And then the government at that time didn't want to take any drastic actions, and indeed was a bit disconnected from the reality of the crisis. The Prime Minister who conducted the first negotiation with the IMF package, we concluded negotiation, I think about September, October, and then he resigned. He had to resign. The public had little confidence in the cabinet at that time, and we had a new cabinet coming in November with good groups of professionals that could command confidence. But I should mention that if you may recall, a few years before the 1997 crisis, we had a coup d'etat And after coup d'etat, there was also a big demonstration in Bangkok, a bloodshed demonstration. So there was a public call for constitutional reform. And the constitutional reform at that time, during that time, preceding the crisis, was considered as a people's constitution. That's what we call even today. A lot of participation by different groups of people. It was chaired by one of our most respected Prime Minister Anand Panjarachun. And the completion of that constitutional reforms occurred around September or October of 1997. So we had the reform of the constitution taking place a few months after the floating of the exchange rate. And everyone had a very high hope that it would help change the political system of Thailand, which it did.
So you said there were constitutional changes. What exactly did you all change?
A few things. One thing is to promote decentralization. Having a central government commanding so much authority is not helpful. So with the new constitution in 1997, we promoted decentralization. The other thing was trying to address the issues of small parties, leading to coalition governments, and everyone was quite sick of having weak coalition governments not being able to address reform for the country. So the electoral system, we introduced the concept of party lists. That's by that way that promotes big parties, and that led to subsequent election that we had two big political parties competing. That created another problem, as you may have seen, the red shirt, the yellow shirt, as you may have seen in the news. So we're also in the process of finding the right balance of our political system. The other thing is that came with that constitution is to create what we call independent entities, like anti-corruption entity, which would not be under political influence. We had a new electoral commission to oversee all elections from the national level to the provincial level. So the concept of independent organization, so that hoping that it would be little or less political interference into their work. So those were few key principles, if I may recall, of the new constitution that came in 1997.
Can you briefly tell us, your king is highly revered and respected. He has moral authority. Did he play a role in calming the nation?
His late Majesty the King, Brahma the Ninth, my personal view is that he had provided a great deal of spirit. I would not say it, I think one could say it, spiritual role, and also important guiding principles for Thai people, for the general public, and also for policymakers at that time. If you may recall, there was a philosophy that the king highlighted post-1997 crisis called Sufficiency economic principle. This Sufficiency economic principle focused on the principles of moderation. Obviously, we had over-investment before the crisis. People had basically overconsumed, lived beyond their means. So the kings emphasized the principles of moderation. The king also emphasized the principles of reasonableness. Whatever you do, make sure that there's rationale, strong rationale behind it, and reasonable. You may recall during that time we had speculation, we had asset price bubbles, and we had many wrong policies, missteps, policy mistakes from the macro level down to the household level. And another thing that was very important is the principles of immunity, making sure that to be able to get through with the world that would be increasingly volatile, complex, from the household levels to the national level, we have to make sure that we create sufficient immunity. So these are the three core principles of the sufficiency economic principles, and obviously it has to be based on the fundamentals of good ethics and knowledge. By promoting these principles, I think the king has provided, I would say, the light at the end of the tunnel for the general public. He didn't intervene in the policy making, intervene in politics, but he did provide something that highly valuable guiding principles for the society and economy.
Thank you. So can you give us what were the key lessons for the design and execution of the Thai stabilization plan?
Yeah. If I step back a bit, for a crisis of that magnitude, there was no single panacea. So it had to be combinations of measures. Okay? And I can think of maybe 5 categories of measures that we introduced. The first one related to stabilization. Stabilization package was very important. When the exchange rate was free falling, we had to stabilize that. When people had no confidence in the banking system, the depositors were taking deposits out of the bank. Money market, interbank market became non-functioning, so we had to stabilize the money market.
What was the interest rates like?
It went up to about 25%.
Okay.
Imagine depositors going to small banks, taking all the deposits out and putting deposits into foreign banks or large banks. So it was deposit outflows from small financial institutions to foreign banks. What the foreign banks and the large bank did, they lent that money back to the Bank of Thailand, and the Bank of Thailand circled that money to provide liquidity to the small financial institutions. So this is like a vicious circle, and along the way, interest rates had to be bid up to deter such round-tripping behavior. So when the money market went up to about 25%, no business would be able to survive. So we had to basically, improve confidence, stabilize the functioning of interbank market, the money market, while also providing confidence in the foreign exchange market. So that's category is related to stabilization. The other category is related to fiscal stimulus. Fortunately, we didn't have large fiscal deficits leading to the crisis. And the IMF in the first package, and they also admitted publicly as the mistake, because they wanted Thailand to restrict fiscal spending. So they set the primary budget surplus target in the first letter of intent. But we managed to negotiate with them and substantially relax the fiscal condition so that the government would be able to use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy. So that's fiscal stimulus, the second category of measures. The third one is related to economic restructuring, particularly restructuring of the banking sector. That's very important because it's the root cause of the Thai banking crisis. Resolution of distressed assets is also very important. We had to come up with a series of measures, from changing the bankruptcy framework, setting up specialized agency to deal with distressed assets, auctioning off some of the distressed assets, setting up Thai asset management companies as a central depositories of distressed assets to allow for orderly resolution of distressed assets. We also liberalized foreign investments regulatory framework. Although we had open FDI framework leading to the crisis, but the service sector was very much protected. So we had to amend the foreign business law to allow foreign participation in service sector, and also privatization, state-owned enterprises. There were quite a number of state-owned enterprises that created large contingent liabilities for the government. So the third category is related to economic restructuring and liberalization. The fourth category that was very important, and I'd like to echo the importance as Mr. President highlighted in his speech, is protecting the most vulnerable group of people. The people at the bottom of the pyramid got hit the most when a crisis like that hit. So we had to come up with a number of programs to safeguard the livelihood of these people. And lastly is related to institutional building, institutional reform. The Bank of Thailand was a major player leading to the crisis. There was a big amendment of the Central Banking Act. There was capacity improvement in the Ministry of Finance. The new Public Debt Management Office was set up because managing public debt became a big burden for the Thai authorities. We didn't have to deal with public debt before. But then when public debt went up to 30-40% of GDP, we need to have a specialized agency doing that. We also set up a state-owned enterprise policy office to centralize the supervisions of state-owned enterprises. Before state-owned enterprises, supervisory authority lie with the line ministry, like Thai Airways International is under the Ministry of Transportation. The other state-owned enterprise is under another ministry. So it became pet project of the respective ministers. So we centralized the supervisory oversight by setting up a special office in the Ministry of Finance. Those are some examples of the institutional reforms. So
What about
on your points about key lessons learned from the Thai crisis, given a lot of measures that need to be put in place in a comprehensive package, I would like to highlight perhaps 6 key principles. Firstly, credibility of the stabilization program and reform program was utmost important. Credibility, is key, and it has to be. The program has to be credible in the eyes of the local people as well as the international financial community, and we have to make sure that there's strong credibility in the design of the program and also in the execution of the program. So that's very important. If you have stabilization program or reform programs that are not sufficiently credible, there's a high likelihood that the program will not succeed, and you will end up having to have stronger program afterwards, creating more pain in the transition process. So that's the first one, credibility, that I need to highlight. The second aspect that is very important is the essence of time. The government that was in charge before 1997 floating of the exchange rate, they were in denial stage. Basically, they thought that the pictures of the conditions of macroeconomic situation were basically narratives of the opposition, and they were disconnected from the reality, and they underestimated the magnitude of the crisis. They didn't accept that the causes of the crisis were structural. They thought that some of the problems could be dealt with by transitory measures, and by kicking the can along the road, that created a much larger burden for anyone in the society. Basically, as we all know, interest go up every day, right? One day that you delay restructuring of the debt, that adds more cost to the society. And I also need to emphasize that in a crisis situation, obviously there are a lot of things at hand that need to be done immediately. What one also need to have forward-looking views of what could go wrong, and scenarios analysis would be important, and make sure that we take proper safeguarding action against those potential scenarios. Sometimes we're focusing on problems at hand too much without paying sufficient attention on possible future scenarios. So we tend to react to to immediate problems. But dealing with the crisis, when we have to talk about stabilization, talking about restructuring, we need to be quite forward-looking in the measures that we do while competing with the time. The third issue that I would like to highlight from our lessons is the fact that macroeconomic problems need to be tackled first by macroeconomic policies. Obviously, macroeconomic policy, the like of stabilization, the way exchange rate work, monetary policy work, politicians might not have good understanding and might not appreciate those stabilization policies. And they often come with something they're quite familiar with, which are microeconomic policies, microeconomic measures to micromanage small things here and there. When we had large current account deficit, when we had wrong exchange rate regime, you could not solve that problem by having import license alone. You could not solve that problem by restricting capital flows. It would have, or it did undermine confidence, leading to more capital outflows. But we need to make sure that the key macroeconomic problems have been taken care of by proper macroeconomic policies in the stabilization package, not by microeconomic measures. So that's the third principle that I learned from the crisis. The fourth principle that I would like to highlight in our case is very much related to how we had to deal with the banking crisis. In a crisis of our magnitude, it is impossible to help everyone. The most important thing is to safeguard the functioning of the core system. So we had to separate the bad banks from the good banks. I mean, the banks that had liquidity problem, had insolvency problems, from the banks that would have potential to stay on and serve as a core of the banking system to facilitate economic recovery. And we obviously the public would also be calling for help. We had to be very specific, very targeted about the groups of vulnerable peoples that we had to deal with, or we had to provide assistance because of the limited resources. If we were trying to help everyone, there's a high chance that no one would survive. Prioritization is very important, and it's a prioritization based on the economic justification to make sure that the core functioning of the economy could continue to carry on its duty. Otherwise, if you can't preserve the core functioning of the system, stabilization will not be able to complete. The fifth guiding principle that I would like to offer is that the direction of stabilization program and the restructuring liberalization program, that tends to be on a medium to long term, they need to be aligned. Mm-hmm. They need to be consistent. When we talk about state-owned enterprises creating contingent liabilities of the government, we want to stop that contingent liabilities. Has to be aligned with long-term liberalization of the sectors that state-owned enterprises operate with. You have to be aligned with the privatization strategies. Distressed assets resolution. We need quick resolutions, but we don't want to undermine good credit culture in our banking system. So we need to have quite a number of restrictions. For instance, when we auction off distressed assets, obviously the government would like to get as much revenue from the auction so that it would reduce fiscal costs of the government. But we had to ensure that the debtors would not be allowed to bid on their own distressed asset. Mm-hmm. It would undermine the credit culture of the whole system. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there were nominees coming in here and there, but we had to be very, very strict about this principle. So the interaction between the design of stabilization programs and the long-term restructuring programs have to go hand in hand and need to be properly aligned. And lastly, when we have a crisis, coordination failure gets magnified. It's a big problem. In normal times, in Thailand, we already have coordination failures. Different government agencies work within their silo frameworks, work within their legal mandate. But during a crisis, we need strong coordination, strong cooperation. This is need strong people to manage the coordination, and also to create proper incentives for different parties to behave in the way that we would like to see. For instance, most of the corporations, they had more than one creditors. And to come up with debt restructuring, you need all creditors to agree, right? Otherwise, you cannot make sure that that company would be able to survive or would be able to come out from the distressed balance sheet position. So we had to set up a new framework on corporate debt restructuring, and had people coming in serving as mediator, doing balance sheet analysis on behalf of the creditors, and had a new.
Did you have a comprehensive bankruptcy law, or did you have to draw up one?
Our bankruptcy law was not up to date, and it favored debtors too much. So we had a lot of what we call strategic NPLers, those who could service their debt but decided not to. So we had to amend the bankruptcy law to make sure that firstly, it provides proper incentives, and also we had to introduce the concept of business rehabilitation into the bankruptcy law. Our old bankruptcy law didn't provide opportunity for business rehabilitation, or Chapter 11 in the US. It's very important, and you have to be able to protect new lending by creditors. During the rehabilitation process, for instance. We also had to set up a new bankruptcy court. Before the 1997 crisis, bankruptcy cases went through the civil courts. And obviously, with the magnitude of the distressed assets, there were not enough judges who had good understanding of finance, particularly on complicated matters. And we needed to have speedy resolution process. We also need to have speedy foreclosure process. And for some small thing like the seniority of debt, the old bankruptcy law didn't provide sufficient seniorities of debt to employees. So what happened when a company is filed for bankruptcies, all the employees resign. But if we would like to promote business rehabilitation, was critical at that time. We had to ensure that the seniority of debt to employees has the same status. I think it was upgraded to the same status as a debt to the revenue department, to the government, so that the employees would continue to stay on and facilitate the rehabilitation process.
If I can move on to the political dimension, so how did they build credibility for the reform program?
Looking back, one key aspect of credibility was the fact that the government that came in November of 1997 brought in outsiders, professionals of economic and finance professionals who were very well respected by Thai people and by the finance and economic community, to take charge of Deputy Prime Minister on economic affairs, Minister of Finance, economic advisors were so strong professionals.
You brought professionals into parliament, is it?
Not into parliament, into cabinet.
Into cabinet.
Into
right.
cabinet. Yeah.
Okay.
And they came with their track records. They came with their reputations of reform. And they didn't have to care so much about what the constituency think about reform. So they could carry on the reform process. And given that there were there were finance professionals, they were speaking in the same language as the international financial circles would like to hear. We had to deal with credit rating agencies. We had to deal with international lenders. So they could command respect from the local people and also from the international financial community. I think that's one. Secondly, the IMF programs. On one hand, it restricted a lot of policies that we wished to do, but on the other hand, there was no choice at that time. We had to depend on the IMF programs. But then we use it as a way to build up our own credibility, making sure that we negotiated the conditions that we could deliver. And we had strong commitment to deliver all the conditionalities. After a few years, we decided not to disburse all the money in the program. The size of the program was $17.2 billion. That was huge at that time. And so once we started to see our international reserve being built along the way, we could control, stabilize the macro situation. We decided not to disperse the last few tranches of the IMF program. And indeed, we repaid early. This were a way to build up the credibility. And as mentioned, we successfully renegotiated on the fiscal stance with IMF. And by winning over the IMF, and we agreed to relax some of the conditions. That's also a way to build credibility. Thirdly, we adopted a much higher standards of transparency, like our international reserves. And everyone was so suspicious about the amount of international reserve that the Bank of Thailand had leading to the crisis. Afterwards, the Bank of Thailand decided to disclose the level of international reserves on the weekly basis with 2 weeks lag. That's obviously that was also influenced by the IMF, but looking back, it helped provide a lot of credibility. But that's also because the stabilization program worked, and we changed the floating exchange rate regime, allowing the central banks to be able to accumulate reserves bit by bit. And when exports in the subsequent years, went up strongly, that brought in international reserves for the country. So transparency was very, very, very important. We disclosed NPL information on international standards. Before the crisis, the Bank of Thailand's NPL number was 7%. But after the crisis, with international standards and with massive bankruptcy, it went up to 47%. So by disclosing using international standards, it eliminated all the doubts. And when you have a lot of doubts in the financial community, you can't build credibility. And lastly, I need to emphasize that communication is very important. The government at that time had to do a lot of proactive communication to different segments of the society, to opinion leaders, to the general public, to politicians in different camps of the parliament.
Okay. The root cause of the crisis was from your central bank. So what were the kind of changes that were made?
There were quite a number of measures on reforming the central bank that were introduced. Firstly, the Bank of Thailand Act was amended to ensure independence, policy independence, and operational independence of the central bank. We had some political interference into the work of the Bank of Thailand before the crisis on both exchange rate regime and also on bank supervision. So by reforming the Central Bank Act, the governor, there was a new selection process, appointment process of the governor that was not linked with the government. Before the crisis, when we had a new ministers and if the minister didn't like the governor, he could just change the governor for whatever reason, appropriate reasons. But
it's a fixed term?
Now it's a fixed term, 5 years, and can be renewed once. And the selection process is done through a committee of eminent persons.
Right.
And the governor cannot be dismissed unless he or she has conducted gross negligence, major gross negligence. We also improve transparency and accountability framework of the central banks in the new law. We also try to limit possibility of policy mistakes. So in the new law, we had a number of a few policy committee, like monetary policy committee, financial institution policy committee, payment system policy committee. And in these committees, there are more outsiders than insiders to ensure that there would not be policy mistakes by the groupthink of people in the central bank. Monetary policy committee, we had 4 outsiders and 3 governor and deputy governors of the central bank, for instance. We also changed from the fixed exchange rate regime to inflation targeting. Mm-hmm. And inflation targeting has also been incorporated into our law as a policy framework of the Bank of Thailand. And lastly, I would say that we decided to adopt international standards in all aspects of our work. Disclosure standards, banking regulations, licensing standards. So these were important changes in the Bank of Thailand.
Mm-hmm. Apart from the central bank reform, were there any other crucial institutional reforms?
I mentioned quite a number of them, like the creations of the Public Debt Management Office in the Ministry of Finance to coordinate efficient public debt management, and also to develop the local bond market. Mm-hmm. To ensure that to be able to accommodate fiscal requirement, a budget deficit requirement, and also the cost of financial sector restructuring. Mm-hmm. We have local financing markets, so that we would not have to depend on external financing as before the crisis. The State-Owned Enterprise Office was also created post-crisis. We enacted what we call the corporatization law to corporatize state-owned enterprises into corporate structure, mm-hmm. so that when we had the right opportunity, we would be able to privatize state-owned enterprises. Mm-hmm. So that was also a big institutional reform, changing the structure and the governance of state-owned enterprises and leading to privatization of some of the key ones. The bankruptcy law we touch upon, on the bankruptcy framework, the Bankruptcy Act, those very important. Corporate governance for the private sector was also key. We set up what we call the Institute of Directors, to ensure that directors of listed companies have to gone through education so that they understand about good corporate governance. The problems for Thailand leading to the 1997 crisis, I would say it's a private sector problem. I mean, the private sector played a lot of roles leading to the crisis, and that's because of the lack of proper corporate governance. So those were some of the key institutional reforms. Another thing that I should highlight is not related directly to the 1997 crisis. We did reform what we call the Fiscal Discipline Act, mm-hmm. to avoid open-ended populist policy. Mm-hmm. You might recall something like the rice pledging schemes, yeah. that one government introduced, and it became a political norm of creating expectations of the public for populist policy like that, and there was no ex ante calculations of the total cost for the government.
There are hard constraints, is it? It's like fiscal deficit 3%.
Yes.
Okay. And finally, we do have a few questions here which we may touch on. But finally, how did these reforms that you did then serve you today? Or how has it helped Thailand over the last 30 years?
I think I can say that the root causes of the 1997 crisis are no longer major risks for the Thai economy. Okay. Wrong policy framework has been corrected. The independence of the Bank of Thailand, the monetary policy framework, the exchange rate regimes, those have been corrected. International reserve has been rebuilt all along. Now we have about 230 billion.
Can you give us
US dollars?
Yeah, need.
I'll carry on that message to the current governor. The banking system, has been quite strong with strong profitability and strong capital base. When we had to go through the 2009 global financial crisis, Thai banks were not affected at all, and Thai banks could continue to provide intermediary functions for the domestic economy. I think the governance structures in the corporate sectors has also improved in a big way. If looking at international ranking, large Thai listed companies have performed quite well on the corporate governance front. So the old problems I think have been solved, but obviously reform is a never-ending mission. We have new problems that we have to deal with. Like before, we didn't have fiscal deficit, we didn't have public debt. Now public debt has indeed exceeded the original framework of 60% of GDP.
Okay.
So last year, after COVID-19, with a lot of measures to stimulate the economy and also to help the most vulnerable groups, the government decided to relax that public debt to GDP restriction.
But what is your interest rates like?
Interest rate is quite low. The policy rate of the Bank of Thailand is at 0.5.
0.5.
And the 2-year bond rate now is about 1.7.
So your cost of servicing that 60% is very low.
Yes, but we know that the cost is going up. Okay. If you look at the global financial market.
And the baht now, you said it went from 25 to 57. Now it's 30?
Now it's about 36.
Oh, so it slipped a little bit.
It went down, it strengthened to about 28, 29,
okay.
5-6 years ago. And only lately when, there's capital flights from emerging markets going back to advanced economies and there's a tightening global financial conditions. So the baht has also depreciated along with other emerging market currencies.
I just have time to take one question which has come through Slido. So about your technocrats and your civil service in Thailand, did you have the capacity to handle the crisis? Or did you have to import people? Or was it basically the local bureaucrats who were able to do all the difficult things?
During the 1997?
Yes.
I think the core teams were existing technocrats at that time. Obviously, we had quite a number of advisors that were coming in to help. Some of the matters were new, and we didn't have to deal with like resolution of distressed assets. Those were new. When we're talking about reforming some of the laws, we had foreign advisors and international advisors coming in to help ensure that we were going in the right direction. But I would say a lot of things could be handled by the technocrats at that time.
I think one hour is up. Any last pieces of advice to Sri Lanka?
Well, I can't say anything more than echoing the statement that Mr. President mentioned in his speech. And as highlighted by the name of this conference, don't lose a good crisis. Make sure that you actually bite the bullet. You can bite the bullet, reset, and move forward. Procrastinating will only increase the cost financially and also socially for the people.
Well said, Dr. Veerathai. Lots of the issues that he raised today are actually in the program for this two-day conference. So we have a session on bankruptcy, we have a few sessions on SOE, we have a few sessions on land and labor, and then also on revenue. So hope many of you will continue to stay with us for the next 2 days so that you can participate in a more deeper discussion. And if you cannot be here, you can follow us through Zoom or social media. Thank you very much once again, Dr. Veerathai.
Most welcome. Thank you very much.